something is happening in the spiritual realm, and most people will not notice it. But you are not like most people, because this message is not for everyone. It is for the chosen ones. Between April 19th, 20th, and 21st, a spiritual shift is unfolding, quietly, invisibly, but powerfully, and those who ignore it may miss what they have been praying for all their lives, not because God is silent, but because they were not paying attention. So the question is simple: will you recognize the moment, or will you let it pass you by? The shift you cannot see, but will feel. There are moments in life that do not announce themselves with noise. They do not arrive with warning, and they do not introduce themselves in a way that feels obvious. Nothing changes on the surface at first glance, yet something underneath begins to shift quietly, almost imperceptibly. It is like the air before a storm, when everything still looks normal, but the atmosphere has already changed its intention. Spiritually, this is one of those moments where what is happening cannot be fully explained by what is visible, and many people experience it before they understand it. Life begins to feel slightly misaligned. Things that were supposed to move forward suddenly slow down without explanation. Plans that seemed certain begin to stall, not because of failure, but because of delay that carries no clear reason. At the same time, an emotional weight can appear without warning, not tied to any specific event, but still deeply present. It feels like something is pressing inward from the unseen, creating a sense of anticipation that is hard to ignore. Alongside this, relationships and connections begin to shift. Some people quietly step away without conflict. Others become distant without explanation. Doors that once seemed open simply stop responding. And yet, none of it feels fully random. There is a pattern, but it is not immediately visible. It is experienced more than it is understood. And in the middle of all this, a deeper sensation begins to form internally, something many cannot easily describe. It is not exactly anxiety, and it is not simple fear. It feels more like pressure, but not from the outside. It is an internal pressure, like something is building beneath the surface of life itself. A sense that something is approaching, even though there is no physical evidence of it yet. It is quiet, persistent, and difficult to ignore once it begins. The mind tries to explain it logically, but logic does not fully contain it. It lingers in the background like an unspoken message trying to surface. This is where misunderstanding often begins. People try to label it as coincidence, stress, emotional exhaustion, or simply the unpredictability of life. But spiritually, there is another layer that many do not consider. This is not random disturbance. This is alignment pressure, a process that does not announce itself through external events first, but through internal shifting. It is as if life begins reorganizing itself quietly before anything visible changes. Because when something greater is being prepared for a person, everything that is not compatible with that next stage begins to respond first. Not as punishment, but as separation. Not as destruction, but as adjustment. What cannot align with the next level begins to loosen its hold naturally. That is why certain people drift away, why certain situations collapse without warning, and why certain paths suddenly stop responding. It is not always a sign of loss in the way it feels emotionally. Sometimes it is a sign of repositioning. This is also why resistance often increases internally during such periods. The human mind tends to interpret change as instability, especially when it has not yet seen the outcome. But what feels like instability may actually be preparation, a clearing process that removes what cannot continue into the next phase. And although it may feel uncomfortable, it is rarely without purpose. And this is where the timing becomes important. The window around April 19th, 20th, and 21st begins to feel different in this context. Not because the dates themselves hold physical power, but because certain periods in life carry a weight that is felt internally before it is understood externally. It becomes less about the calendar and more about the sense that something is shifting in the background of life. Even silence begins to feel meaningful during such times. Even delays begin to feel structured rather than accidental. Even endings begin to feel like part of something larger unfolding. And without needing visible confirmation, there is a quiet awareness that something is already moving, rearranging, and preparing itself in ways that are not yet fully seen. Part 2. What God is doing in this window. Listen carefully, because what is being shared here is not meant to create fear, confusion, or emotional disturbance. This is not a warning meant to destabilize you. This is about preparation, and there is a difference between the two that many people fail to recognize. Fear makes people reactive. Preparation makes people aware. Fear creates panic. Preparation creates alignment. And what is unfolding in this window is not random emotional pressure. It is structured spiritual movement that operates with precision, even when it is not immediately understood. In this short window, something deeper is happening in 3 distinct layers. Not metaphorically, but in terms of spiritual progression that affects perception, timing, and internal awareness. The first layer is exposure. Hidden truths are beginning to surface in ways that cannot be controlled or delayed. What was once covered, concealed, or unclear is now starting to reveal itself without effort. This includes situations that were confusing, relationships that were unclear, and intentions that were never fully visible. People's real intentions will begin to surface without you needing to force clarity. It will simply become obvious through actions, patterns, and responses. What was hidden will begin to show, not because you demanded it, but because timing is revealing it. The second layer is separation. This is often the most misunderstood part of any spiritual shift. Not everyone who is currently walking with you is assigned to your next season. Some people are present in a chapter that is already closing, even if they do not realize it yet. And as alignment begins to shift, certain connections will naturally break. Not always through conflict, not always through confrontation, sometimes through silence, sometimes through distance, sometimes through simple disconnection that cannot be repaired because it was never meant to continue beyond a certain point. This is not punishment, it is filtering. It is alignment, removing what cannot carry forward into the next phase of your journey. And then comes the third layer, acceleration. This is where things begin to shift in a way that feels sudden, almost unexpected. For those who are attentive, obedient to inner direction, and aware of the subtle shifts happening within them, progress can begin to move faster than expected. What once felt delayed may suddenly open. What felt blocked may begin to flow. What seemed stuck may start to move without resistance. This is not random luck. It is timing alignment, activating momentum that was previously paused. But here's the key that must not be overlooked. This acceleration does not operate equally for everyone. It is not universal in effect. It responds to internal alignment. It benefits those who are spiritually awake, those who are aware, observant, and responsive to inner guidance rather than external noise. Because the same moment that elevates one person can confuse another. The same shift that brings clarity to one mind can create chaos in another. The difference is not in the event itself, but in the level of awareness receiving it. This is why timing matters more than most people realize. Because when acceleration begins, it does not wait for understanding. It moves with or without clarity. And those who are not prepared internally may misinterpret movement as instability, when in reality, it is progression. Meanwhile, those who are aligned internally begin to recognize that what is happening is not disorder, but direction unfolding faster than expected. So what is unfolding in this window is not something to fear, but something to recognize. Exposure is revealing, separation is filtering, acceleration is activating, and all 3 are working together in the background of what may still look like ordinary days on the surface. Part 3. Why many will miss it. Many will miss. The tragedy is not that God is not speaking. That is not where the real problem lies, and it never has been. The deeper issue, the one that often goes unnoticed, is that many are simply not in a position to perceive what is already being communicated. The voice is not absent, the signal is not missing, the message is not blocked. What is missing, in many cases, is attention, awareness, stillness of mind, and the capacity to recognize subtle direction when it does not arrive in the form of urgency or noise. because distraction has become so normal that it no longer feels like distraction. It feels like life. Some are constantly surrounded by noise, not just external noise, but internal noise as well. Thoughts that never settle, emotions that fluctuate without grounding, information that is consumed endlessly without reflection. And in that state, even clarity becomes difficult to recognize because everything feels equally important and equally urgent. Others become addicted to chaos without realizing it, not necessarily because they desire disorder, but because calm feels unfamiliar, stillness feels uncomfortable, and silence feels like something is missing rather than something is speaking. So they unconsciously gravitate toward situations, environments, and mental states that keep them stimulated, even if it drains their awareness. Over time, chaos becomes a pattern of comfort, even when it is destructive. There are also those who are emotionally reactive, where every situation immediately triggers response without pause for discernment. Every delay feels like rejection. Every silence feels like abandonment. Every shift feels like loss. And in that constant reaction, there is little space left for interpretation beyond emotion. Everything is filtered through feeling, which makes deeper perception more difficult to access. And then there are those who are spiritually asleep, not in a judgmental sense, but in a state of disconnection from inner awareness. Life continues, decisions are made, days pass, but there is little internal reflection about direction, alignment, or meaning. Things are experienced, but not deeply processed, and without processing, awareness remains surface level. Finally, there are those who are simply too busy, not necessarily in a negative sense, but in a way where constant activity leaves no room for reflection. Movement replaces awareness, productivity replaces stillness, and schedules replace sensitivity. Over time, subtle guidance becomes harder to notice, not because it is not present, but because there is no space left to receive it. And this is why, when something shifts quietly, only the sensitive will perceive it. Not the loudest, not the busiest, not the most reactive, but those who are still enough internally to notice when something changes without announcement. Because divine movement, in its most significant moments, rarely arrives with external confirmation first. It begins in silence, in awareness, in subtle internal recognition that something has shifted before anything external proves it. This is also why Scripture often reflects this pattern. Major divine shifts are not typically presented through public announcements or emotional spectacle. They are revealed through silence, through timing, and through discernment, through moments where nothing appears to be happening externally, yet everything is being reorganized internally and invisibly. The pattern is consistent. Transformation begins quietly before it becomes visible. And this leads to an important realization. During such periods, the greatest danger is not external attack. It is not opposition. It is not visible resistance. The real danger is spiritual blindness, the inability to perceive what is already unfolding because attention is directed elsewhere. When awareness is compromised, even guidance becomes difficult to interpret. Not because it is unclear, but because it is not being received in a state that can recognize it. And so the question is not whether something is being communicated. The question is whether there is enough stillness to notice it. Part 4. What the chosen ones should do. If you are truly part of those who feel this message, then your response matters more than your understanding. Because in moments like this, comprehension alone is not enough. Many people understand what is happening and still miss the benefit of it. Others may not fully understand everything, yet their response aligns them correctly with what is unfolding. This is why reaction, posture, and internal discipline matter more than analysis during times of transition. There is a way to move through this window that brings clarity instead of confusion, alignment instead of resistance. And it begins with a conscious decision to respond differently than you normally would. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but with awareness. First, stay spiritually grounded. This means resisting the urge to panic when things feel uncertain or unstable. Do not overthink what is happening around you. Overthinking creates distortion, It multiplies possibilities without grounding you in truth. Instead, remain steady in your inner state. Not everything that shifts is a threat, and not everything that feels uncomfortable is negative. Grounding is what prevents interpretation from turning into fear. Second, reduce noise. This is not just about external distractions, but also internal ones. Limit anything that weakens your focus or scatters your attention. Constant stimulation, unnecessary conversations, emotional overconsumption, and mental overload all contribute to confusion during sensitive periods. The less noise there is, the easier it becomes to perceive direction clearly. Silence is not emptiness in this context. It is clarity in preparation. Third, observe patterns. During this time, awareness becomes more important than reaction. Pay attention to repetition in your experiences. Repeated thoughts, repeated dreams, repeated encounters, repeated feelings that return without explanation. These are not random. They often carry directional significance. Inner warnings, subtle impressions, and recurring signs should not be dismissed quickly. Observation without immediate judgment allows deeper understanding to form naturally over time. Fourth, do not force anything. This is one of the most important principles during transitional alignment. If something is leaving, let it leave. If something is closing, do not try to reopen it through force. If a path is no longer responding, do not exhaust yourself trying to revive it. Forcing creates resistance against timing, and resistance often leads to confusion, exhaustion, and misalignment. Sometimes the most powerful action is non-interference. Allowing things to move without resistance preserves clarity and emotional balance. Fifth, stay in alignment, because alignment is the determining factor between whether this shift benefits you or disorients you. Alignment is not about controlling external events. It is about maintaining internal coherence while external things change. When you are aligned, even unexpected changes contribute to progress. When you are misaligned, even opportunities can feel overwhelming or confusing. Alignment is what translates movement into direction instead of chaos. And through all of this, there is a deeper principle that must be remembered. Sometimes, God does not change your situation immediately. The circumstances may remain the same for a moment longer than expected. The environment may not shift right away. The external structure may appear unchanged. But what is happening instead is often more subtle and more significant. Sometimes, the change is not in your situation, but in your position. And that distinction changes everything. Because when position changes internally, even unchanged situations begin to respond differently over time. Part 5. The test inside the window. This period is also a test, but not in the way most people assume when they hear the word test. It is not a test of knowledge, and it is not a test of information. It is not about how much someone understands spiritually, nor about how many concepts they can explain or repeat. Understanding alone does not determine outcome in moments like this. What matters here is something far more immediate, far more revealing, and far more difficult to fake. It is a test of response. Because response reveals what knowledge cannot. It reveals instinct, conditioning, emotional structure, and internal alignment. It shows what a person does when certainty is removed and when clarity is not immediate. In moments of transition, information becomes secondary. Reaction becomes the real language of identity. And this is where the distinction between people becomes visible. Because two people can go through the exact same situation at the same time, with the same external conditions, and yet experience entirely different internal outcomes. Nothing about the outside needs to change for the difference to appear. The difference is not in what happens, it is in how it is carried internally. One person panics, not always loudly, but internally. The moment uncertainty appears, the mind accelerates into fear-based interpretation. Every delay becomes a threat. Every silence becomes a warning. Every shift becomes something to resist. And in that state, emotional instability increases. The focus moves outward, trying to control what cannot be controlled. And in doing so, internal direction becomes fragmented. Panic does not always create movement. It often creates confusion. The other person observes, not passively, but consciously. Instead of reacting immediately, there is a pause. Instead of assigning meaning too quickly, there is awareness. Instead of forcing interpretation, there is patience. Observation allows space between stimulus and response, and in that space, clarity can form. This does not mean there is no emotion. It means emotion does not lead the decision-making process. One person forces control. When uncertainty appears, they attempt to fix, adjust, or override the situation immediately. They push against timing, trying to accelerate outcomes through pressure. But forced control often creates resistance, and resistance does not always produce progress. It often produces exhaustion. The more control is forced externally, the more unstable internally things can become. The other person trusts timing, not in a passive way, but in a grounded way. They understand that not everything responds to immediate action, and not everything requires immediate intervention. Timing is not seen as delay, but as structure, and when timing is trusted, energy is conserved instead of scattered. Decisions become more intentional rather than reactive. There is less distortion in interpretation and more stability in perception. One person loses direction because every reaction pulls them slightly away from inner clarity. Each emotional spike shifts focus outward, and over time, the sense of internal compass becomes weaker. The path feels more confusing, not because the path changed, but because perception is constantly shifting. The other person enters elevation. Not necessarily immediately visible, but internally they stabilize. They become less affected by external fluctuation. They begin to move with awareness rather than reaction. And over time, this creates a different trajectory entirely. Not because the situation is different, but because the response is different. And so the real question is not centered on external events. It is not about trying to decode every detail of what is happening on April 19th, 20, or 21. That focus alone misses the deeper layer of what is being revealed. The real question is this: who are you becoming while it is happening? Part 6. A final warning and clarity. Let this be clear from the beginning, so that what is being communicated is not misunderstood or distorted in the mind of the listener. This message is not being delivered to create fear. It is not meant to disturb your peace or amplify anxiety about the future. It is not pointing toward danger in the way many people instinctively assume when they hear urgency in tone or depth in meaning. Instead, its purpose is far more subtle, and at the same time far more important. It is here to awaken awareness, because awareness is often the difference between alignment and misalignment in moments that carry spiritual weight. Not every shift announces itself loudly. In fact, the most significant moments in a person's journey rarely come with obvious signs. They do not always appear dramatic or emotionally intense in the beginning. Instead, they often pass through life quietly, disguised as ordinary decisions, subtle impressions, or easily dismissed feelings. And this is where many people unknowingly lose what was meant for them. Because missed moments in destiny are rarely loud. They do not come with alarms or visible warnings that demand immediate attention. They are subtle, almost too subtle for the distracted mind to fully register. They appear in small openings, brief impressions, internal nudges, or situations that do not seem important at first glance. Nothing forces attention toward them externally, which is why internal awareness becomes so essential. A decision not taken can become one of those silent turning points, not because the opportunity was impossible, but because hesitation altered its trajectory. A direction ignored can also carry weight, not because the path was unclear, but because it was overlooked in favor of something more immediate or more comfortable. A sign dismissed can also shift outcomes, not because the sign lacked meaning, but because it was not given space to be considered fully. And over time, these subtle moments accumulate. Not always in obvious ways at first, but gradually, something changes in timing. And suddenly, what once felt open begins to feel different. What once felt aligned begins to shift. What once felt available no longer responds in the same way. It is not always immediate, and it is not always easy to trace back to a single moment. But there is often a point where timing quietly adjusts, and things no longer unfold in the same direction they once were. This is why awareness matters so deeply during sensitive periods. Because when awareness is present, even subtle shifts are noticed in time to respond with clarity. But when awareness is absent, even important signals can pass unnoticed until they have already moved beyond reach. So if during this period you feel something within you stirring, something internal that is difficult to fully explain, something that feels like quiet pressure, subtle intuition, or heightened sensitivity, do not dismiss it quickly. Do not reduce it immediately to coincidence or overthinking. Instead, allow space for it to exist without rushing to label it. Slow down. This slowing down is not about stopping life, but about reducing internal noise so perception becomes clearer. When movement inside becomes calmer, understanding becomes more precise. What was once unclear begins to form structure when it is not being mentally rushed. Listen more, not just externally, but internally as well. Pay attention to impressions that repeat, thoughts that return without force, and feelings that persist without clear cause. These are often the places where awareness is trying to surface, and move with intention. Not reaction, not urgency, not emotional pressure, but intention, where action is guided by awareness rather than confusion, because intention aligns movement with direction, and direction determines outcome more than speed ever will. Now I want to hear from you. If you are feeling this shift in your spirit, if something within you resonates with this message, write in the comments, "I am aware and I will not miss my season." And tell me where you are watching from, because this is not just a video, it is a moment of awareness shared by many across the world, unfolding in different places but pointing toward the same inner realization. Not every date is ordinary, even when it appears so on the surface. Not every silence is empty, even when nothing seems to be happening externally. And not every delay is rejection, even when it feels that way in the moment. Sometimes what feels like delay is actually preparation taking place in the background, shaping what is not yet visible. So during April 19th, 20, and 21, do not look for noise or dramatic signs to confirm what is happening. Look instead for direction, for subtle shifts, for inner clarity that does not rely on external validation. Because those who are able to recognize timing when it is quiet are often the ones who move into their next stage without unnecessary struggle. They don't force what is not ready, and they don't miss what is quietly opening. And those who don't recognize it in time often only understand it later, after the moment has already passed, when reflection replaces opportunity and awareness comes after the shift has already moved on.